Lonely rancher gave his donkey to a lost Apache. Next day, 50 cowboys came. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At the first light of dawn, 50 Apache warriors sat frozen on their painted horses, forming a flawless circle around a rancher's ragged tent. Their faces, streaked with ceremonial paint, betrayed neither anger nor mercy. Each man carried something different in his weathered hands: woven blankets, carved bows, sacred stones, strips of dried venison, but not one reached for a weapon. They did not shout, they did not threaten, they simply waited, silent as the desert itself, as if Elias Harper, the forgotten rancher inside, had become the center of a sacred ritual he was never meant to see. Elias pressed his calloused hand against the canvas flap, peering through a tear where the stitching had long since unraveled. His throat tightened, dry as the desert dust that coated his boots. He had lived through drought, sickness, and the cruel neglect of neighbors who barely remembered his name, but never had he seen such a sight. He knew Apache war parties. He'd seen the aftermath of raids, heard the wails of mothers burying children, and felt the burning fear that turned even strong men brittle. Yet this circle was something else entirely. The horses snorted and shifted, stamping the hard earth as the morning sun stretched its first gold across the sand. The warriors did not move. They watched the tent, 50 pairs of eyes fixed on him with a gravity that felt heavier than a rifle barrel pressed to his chest. Elias's mind raced. Why him? Why now? He was no soldier, no lawman. Just a solitary rancher scraping by on the edge of nowhere, his cattle thin, his well running shallow. If he vanished today, no white town would mourn him. And yet here they were, 50 of the most feared riders in the territory, surrounding his tent not with arrows or fire, but with offerings. His breath caught as he noticed the gestures. Each time a warrior's gaze locked with his own, the man would lower his object to the ground, touch his chest once, then return to stillness. It was deliberate, repeated, ritualistic. Elias did not know their words, but he recognized reverence when he saw it. A shiver traced his spine. Yesterday he had been a man with nothing but an old horse and the ache of memories best left buried. Yesterday he was invisible. Now, in the glow of dawn, he was being treated with honor he did not understand, honor that pressed down on him like the weight of mountains. Elias pulled back from the flap, resting against the tent's frame. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneasy rhythm. He tried to recall every choice of the last 24 hours, searching for a thread that explained why he now stood at the heart of something sacred. And then he remembered. The woman, the Apache girl whose blood stained the red rocks, whose breathing had been faint as a candle flame in the desert wind. The memory struck like a hammer, and Elias knew, whatever this circle meant, it had begun yesterday with her. The day before, the desert had been merciless. For 3 days, the sun had scorched the land without pity, baking the earth until it cracked and shimmered like broken glass. Elias Harper led his weary horse along the ridgeline, eyes searching for shade or a trickle of water. His lips were cracked, his canteen nearly empty. He had learned long ago that on this frontier, hope was often the only currency a man could afford. That was when he saw her. A figure lay sprawled against the red rocks, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Elias slowed, suspicion biting first before compassion could speak. Her long dark hair was tangled and stiff with dried blood. Her buckskin clothing, torn at the shoulder, was marked with the red handprints of injury and dust. An Apache. Elias's instinct screamed to keep moving. Trouble always followed an Apache, either her own people or white men looking for vengeance. He had lived long enough to know that stepping into someone else's war was a quick way to get yourself killed. But the way her breath rasped, thin and broken, stopped him cold. He slid from his saddle, boots crunching on gravel, and knelt beside her. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark, unfocused eyes clouded with pain. She tried to speak, but only a ragged whisper escaped. Elias looked around desperately. The nearest water was miles off. She wouldn't last an hour on foot. His horse, old Duke, shifted uneasily behind him, the leather creaking under the strain of heat and thirst. Elias's heart clenched. That horse was more than an animal. Duke was his means of hauling water, his way to move cattle, his lifeline in a land that devoured the careless. Without Duke, Elias was finished. He stood there a long moment, sweat stinging his eyes, torn between survival and something deeper. The right choice for his body was to walk away. The right choice for his soul was kneeling before him, bleeding into the sand. "Can you ride?" Elias asked hoarsely, though he already knew the answer. She didn't respond. With a groan, he pulled her upright. She was lighter than he expected, yet the dead weight of her exhaustion nearly toppled him. After a struggle, he managed to lift her onto Duke's back. The horse stamped, uneasy, but steadied as if sensing the gravity of the moment. For the first time, the woman's eyes focused on his face. In a voice faint but fierce, she managed 3 words. Apache syllables Elias could not understand, yet felt burn into him like a brand. Then, with the last of her strength, she clicked her tongue, urging Duke forward. Elias stood in the dust, watching as his only companion, his survival, disappeared toward the mountains with a stranger clinging to its back. His arms trembled from the effort, his throat thick with disbelief. When the desert silence closed in again, Elias sank to his knees. He had nothing left, no horse, no water, no protection against the wilderness. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A strange calm, as though an unseen hand had guided his choice. That night, lying on the hard ground with only the stars for company, Elias whispered to the emptiness, "If this is what you wanted, Lord, then let it be." The Apache woman's words still echoed in his mind, 3 foreign syllables that felt less like a goodbye and more like a beginning. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments. The morning after he had given away his horse, Elias Harper awoke to the sound of snorting animals and the creak of saddles. For a moment, he thought it was a nightmare, until he pulled open the flap of his tent. 50 Apache warriors encircled him in absolute silence. Their painted faces caught the slant of the rising sun, their feathers shifting in the breeze. No man moved without purpose. Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. Slowly, he stepped outside. Dust clung to his boots, and his worn shirt was stiff with yesterday's sweat. He felt painfully small beneath their gaze, like a trespasser before a tribunal. The circle parted just enough for one rider to move forward. The man was older, his black hair streaked with silver, his cheeks scarred by old battles. His horse stood steady beneath him, a proud stallion painted with handprints. Authority radiated from him without a word. When he finally spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are Elias Harper." It was not a question. Elias swallowed hard and nodded. "You gave your horse to a dying woman yesterday," the man continued. "That woman is my niece, Tala Nashoba. You saved her life." Elias's jaw tightened. He hadn't known her name. He hadn't expected his reckless act to be remembered, certainly not by the leader of 50 armed warriors. "She would not have lived another hour," Gideon said. "The sun would have taken her. Your horse carried her to us. Because of you, my bloodline remains." The chief's words struck Elias like hammer blows. A woman's life had hung in the balance, and by his choice, she was still breathing. He had thought he'd merely handed over a horse, but to them it was more than survival. It was blood preserved, a future secured. Around the circle, warriors murmured in their own tongue, their eyes fixed on him with something Elias could not decipher. It was not hatred, it was not suspicion, it was respect. He shifted uneasily. I didn't think, I just did what felt right. Gideon dismounted with deliberate calm. His boots met the earth with the gravity of ceremony. He stepped close enough for Elias to see the fine beadwork on his belt and the weathering of his hands. In Apache tradition, Gideon said, his voice deep as a drumbeat, saving the life of one who carries our blood is not a small thing. It is sacred. It binds you to us. Elias stared, unsure whether to feel honored or trapped. The idea of being bound to a people most settlers called enemies unsettled him more than he could admit. What does that mean? He asked. Gideon's dark eyes held his. It means the spirits have spoken. It means not all white men are enemies. It means you stand at the edge of two worlds, Elias Harper, and now both worlds will watch you. The weight of the words pressed down on him heavier than any saddle. For the first time in years, Elias felt noticed, not as a drifter, not as a forgotten rancher, but as a man whose actions had altered something larger than himself. The silence stretched, thick as desert heat. Elias knew the ceremony was only beginning, and whatever came next would test him far more than giving away a horse ever had. The circle shifted. One by one, the mounted warriors began to move, their horses stepping forward with solemn grace. Each rider carried something in his hands, not weapons of war, but tokens that bore the weight of tradition. The first warrior dismounted, a man with long braids wrapped in red cloth. From his arms he laid down a woven blanket, dyed in shades of blue and crimson that caught the morning light like a living flame. "This kept my children warm," the warrior said in halting English. "Now it keeps you." He touched his chest once and returned to his horse. The next came forward, younger, his clothing adorned with beads and shells. He placed 2 horses, led by reins, at Elias's feet. "For the man who showed strength of heart," he declared. A third warrior followed, setting down a bundle of dried meat. "So you will not starve." Another placed a bow and quiver, finely crafted. "So you will not be defenseless." And so it continued. One by one, the warriors offered food, tools, leather garments, seeds, ornaments, each gift practical, yet heavy with symbolic meaning. Elias stood frozen, his throat tight. He had come to the desert with little more than a failing ranch and an old horse. Now, here before him lay wealth enough to build a new life, but it felt undeserved. He hadn't saved Tala for reward. He hadn't expected thanks at all. I don't deserve this," Elias murmured, his voice rough. "I just did what any man should have done." Chief Gideon Nashakoba stepped closer, his presence grounding the ceremony. "Many men would not have done what you did," he said firmly. "Many would have turned away, choosing their own life over another's. You gave when you had little to give. That makes the gift greater still." Elias's chest tightened. He thought of the nights he had spent alone by the fire, clutching the small wooden cross his late wife had left him. He remembered her voice, soft but steady, reading from Scripture. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." The verse washed over him now, fresh and piercing. He had not known Tala. She was no friend, no kin, not even an ally. Yet in that moment he had chosen her life over his own survival. Perhaps that was what the verse had always meant, not just dying for someone, but surrendering what little you had so another might live. The gifts piled higher, each one deepening his unease. Respect weighed more heavily than hatred ever had. He felt exposed beneath the gaze of 50 warriors who saw in him something he wasn't sure he believed himself capable of being. Gideon raised his hand, and the circle stilled once more. "These gifts are not payment," the chief declared. "They are acknowledgement. You have stepped onto a path you cannot walk back from. Whether you wish it or not, you are now part of our story." Elias lowered his eyes, staring at the blanket at his feet. The colors blurred as heat and doubt swirled together in his chest. He had been invisible for so long, and now, against his will, perhaps even against his desire, he had become visible in the most dangerous way imaginable. The desert stillness fractured with the distant thunder of hooves. Elias turned, his heart sinking as dust rose on the horizon. Riders. Within moments, 8 settlers came into view, rifles slung and eyes hard. At their head rode Sterling Maddox, a man weathered by years of sun and suspicion. His grizzled beard and scarred hands spoke of work and war alike. Maddox's gaze swept the scene, the Apache circle, the heap of gifts, Elias standing in the center, and hardened into the grim certainty of a man who already believed the worst. "Sweet Lord above," Maddox muttered, pulling his horse to a halt 50 yards away. Kidnapped, surrounded, and ready for the scalping. The settlers fanned out behind him, rifles lifted, horses stamping nervously at the smell of tension. Their presence was like a sudden crack in glass. One wrong move, and the whole ceremony would shatter into blood. The Apache warriors did not break formation. Their silence deepened, bodies taut, hands hovering closer to weapons. Elias felt the air grow heavy, as if the desert itself held its breath. "Hold your positions," Chief Gideon ordered an Apache, his tone low but commanding. Though Elias didn't understand the words, the intent carried clear. The warriors stayed still, though every muscle coiled like a bowstring. Maddox cupped his hands around his mouth and called out across the distance, "Elias, you all right in there? Don't move too fast. Let's get you out of this before they decide to skin you alive." Elias's pulse raced. He could feel both sides watching him, waiting for him to declare where he stood. The settler's suspicion was a shield, the Apache's reverence a chain. He was caught between them, and one wrong word could tip the balance. "I'm all right," Elias shouted back, his voice rough but steady. "They're not here to hurt me." "Like hell they're not," one of Maddox's men spat. 50 Apache don't gather unless there's blood to be spilled." The circle shifted, a ripple of horses stamping, eyes narrowing. Elias felt sweat bead at the back of his neck. "They came to thank me," Elias insisted, louder now. "It's not a war party, it's a ceremony." Maddox barked a laugh, harsh and humorless. "Ceremony? Son, the only ceremony they know ends with graves for our people. Now step towards us, slow and steady, before this gets ugly." Elias froze. To obey Maddox meant abandoning the circle, dishonoring the gifts, and perhaps inviting Apache fury. To stay meant defying his own kind, marking himself as different, maybe even as a traitor. The tension stretched tighter with every breath. He could see settlers shifting in their saddles, fingers brushing triggers. He saw Apache eyes glinting like obsidian, calm but unyielding. Chief Gideon nudged his horse forward a single step. His voice carried across the gap, deep and steady. "We come in peace. We honor the man who saved Apache blood. No harm will come from us." "Peace?" Maddox sneered. "That word never meant a thing coming from your kind." The standoff deepened. Elias's mouth went dry. His decision yesterday had placed him at the heart of something far greater than a simple act of mercy. Now he stood at the edge of two worlds, each demanding his loyalty, each ready to spill blood if he faltered. And somewhere in that silence he understood. The next word spoken could spark a war. The standoff held, every heartbeat stretching like a drawn bowstring. Elias could feel the sweat trickling down his back, the sharp tang of dust in his mouth, the weight of 50 rifles and 50 bows poised for violence. Then, hoofbeats. From the ridge behind the Apache line, a lone figure appeared, riding slow but steady. The rising sun caught the gleam of the horse's mane, and Elias's breath caught in his chest. It was Duke, his horse, his only companion, carrying a rider he thought he might never see again. Tala Nashoba. She sat upright, though her bandaged shoulder betrayed the wound that had nearly taken her life. Her dark hair spilled loose in the morning light, and though her face was pale, her eyes burned with quiet fire. She guided Duke with one hand, the reins steady in her grasp, her posture that of someone who had refused to yield to death. The Apache murmured softly, reverence rippling through the circle. Elias saw it in their faces, relief, pride, vindication. Tala was proof of their tradition, living evidence of the bond Elias had created. The settlers, however, stiffened with shock. Maddox's eyes narrowed as he spat into the dust. "What in God's name?" Tala rode forward until Duke stepped into the center of the circle, standing between Apache and settlers alike. She slid from the saddle with care, wincing at the movement, but she stood tall once her feet touched earth. For a long moment she looked only at Elias. Her gaze held gratitude, yes, but also something fiercer, recognition. Then she turned to face the settlers. Her English was broken, but every word carried the strength of conviction. "This man gave me his horse. He gave everything." She touched her chest, then gestured toward Elias. "I live because of him." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Maddox's men exchanged uneasy glances, rifles still raised, but hands less certain. The notion of a white rancher surrendering his only means of survival to an Apache woman rattled them more than any show of force. Maddox barked. "She could be lying. It's a trick. They always find a way to twist the truth." Tala's dark eyes locked on him. "No lie. His choice saved me. Without him, I am dead." Her voice cracked, but she did not look away. The circle of warriors echoed her words in their tongue, a low chant rising like wind through canyons. It was not war cry, it was affirmation. Elias's chest tightened. He hadn't thought his decision would echo this far, would ripple through cultures and tongues. He had only seen a dying woman. But here she stood, alive because of him, turning his private sacrifice into something public, undeniable. For the first time, Maddox hesitated. His rifle dipped slightly. He searched Elias's face as though hoping to find guilt or shame, something to confirm his prejudice. But Elias held his gaze, weary yet unbroken. "She speaks truth," Elias said quietly. "I gave her my horse, nothing more, nothing less." The settlers murmured again, doubt fracturing their certainty. And in that fragile crack, Elias saw a dangerous possibility. That compassion, once spoken aloud, might weigh heavier than fear. But the circle was far from safe. Suspicion still lingered, rifles still aimed, and one wrong move could still collapse this fragile balance into bloodshed. And in Elias's heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The uneasy balance shattered under the sound of disciplined hoofbeats. Dust rose on the far ridge, not in a scattered cloud like settlers, but in a tight, deliberate column. Sunlight struck polished metal, and Elias's stomach clenched. Soldiers. 20 men in blue uniforms rode in formation, rifles slung at the ready, sabers glinting. At their head rode Captain Silas Hayes, a broad-shouldered officer whose gray beard and steady posture marked him as a veteran of too many frontier conflicts. His presence was calm, but his eyes were sharp, assessing everything with the cool detachment of a man who had learned long ago that appearances could kill. "By authority of the Arizona Territory," Hayes called as his men fanned into a defensive line, "this gathering is now under observation. All weapons stay down. Any blood spilled here will answer to the militia." The settlers straightened in their saddles, emboldened by the arrival of official power. Maddox raised his rifle a little higher, his confidence rekindled. The Apache warriors, however, did not flinch. Their stillness was unbroken, a quiet defiance that seemed to say they needed no permission to conduct what they had begun. Chief Gideon Nashoba urged his horse forward, calm dignity in every measured step. His voice carried clearly across the tension. "We conduct sacred ceremony, not war council. White soldier has no authority here." Hayes's eyes narrowed, though his tone remained even. Sacred or not, 50 armed Apache gathered this close to settlements requires explanation. Maddox seized his chance. "Captain, this rancher was taken captive. They surround him to use him as leverage." "Lies," Gideon answered at once, his voice resonant as thunder. "This man saved my niece, saved Apache blood. We come to honor, not to harm." Hayes shifted his gaze to Elias, weighing him with a soldier's pragmatism. "Is that true?" Elias felt every eye on him, the settler's suspicion, the warrior's solemn expectation, Hayes's piercing scrutiny. He swallowed hard, his voice rough but steady. "It's true. I gave my horse to her." He nodded toward Tala, standing tall despite her wound. She'd have died otherwise. Hayes studied Tala for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching. Finally, Hayes gave a short nod. "Then let it be spoken clear. This is no ambush. This is recognition." The words eased some of the air, though not all. The militia lowered their rifles slightly, but hands lingered on triggers. The settlers muttered, dissatisfied. The Apache held their silence, patient as stone. Hayes lifted his voice again. "Very well. This ceremony proceeds under militia observation. But know this, any hostility from either side, and my men will intervene with full force." The warning hung in the dry air, heavy and absolute. Elias felt it settle deep in his bones. This was no longer a private matter. His single act of mercy had drawn warriors, settlers, and now the territory's armed power into orbit around him. What had begun as a choice made in the wilderness had grown into something far larger, a contest over whether peace or blood would shape the frontier. And Elias knew the ceremony was not finished. The most dangerous part still lay ahead. The ceremony resumed under the watchful eyes of the militia. Captain Hayes kept his horse steady, gaze fixed, while his men spread in a cautious line. Settlers muttered at the edges, still gripping their rifles. But the Apache warriors moved with unwavering composure. One by one, the riders continued their solemn procession. A warrior with weathered hands presented Elias with a finely carved knife, its bone handle polished smooth from years of use. "So you may defend yourself with honor," he said. Another set down a pouch of corn seeds. "So you may plant, and life will grow." A third brought a pair of leather moccasins, their stitching intricate and precise. "So your feet may walk the earth without fear." Each gift landed like a stone in Elias's chest, not for its value, but for its meaning. He felt the weight of a bond he had never sought pressing heavier with every offering. When Tala stepped forward, the circle quieted further. She carried Duke's reins, her hand resting on the horse's neck as though steadying both the animal and herself. In her other hand, she held a small medallion, turquoise set in silver, strung on rawhide. Her voice was soft but clear. "Your horse returns, and with him our promise." She placed the medallion in Elias's palm, folding his fingers around it with surprising strength. Elias stared at the stone's cool surface, its color reflecting the desert sky. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. He had never been given anything of worth without cost attached. Now, strangers who owed him nothing were placing pieces of their heritage, their survival, into his hands. Chief Gideon Neshoba approached last, carrying a blanket woven in red and indigo. He draped it over Elias's shoulders, the wool heavy and warm despite the desert heat. "This belongs to my grandmother," he said solemnly. "It has kept 3 generations alive through bitter winters. Now it keeps you. With this, you are under the protection of my people." The declaration rolled through the circle like thunder. Warriors touched their chests in unison. Even the settlers fell silent for a moment, unsettled by the gravity of what they were witnessing. Elias staggered beneath the blanket's symbolic weight. He was no longer invisible, no longer a man forgotten on the edge of nowhere. He had been pulled into a story larger than himself, a bridge, whether he wanted it or not, between 2 worlds that had only known each other through blood and fire. Captain Hayes, watching from his saddle, murmured just loud enough for Elias to hear, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." The words from Matthew drifted like a balm into the tense air. Elias's chest tightened. Was that what he was now? A peacemaker? He felt anything but blessed. He felt exposed, marked, standing in a place where one wrong step could ignite war. And yet, something deep inside whispered that perhaps this was why he had survived when so many others had not. Perhaps the Lord had not forgotten him after all. The circle slowly broke, the ceremony complete. But the sense of finality never came. Instead, Elias knew he had just crossed a line he could never return from. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The uneasy peace of the ceremony cracked beneath the roar of galloping hooves. From the south, a dozen riders burst over the ridge, dust boiling behind them like smoke from a wildfire. They came fast, reckless, weapons already drawn. At their head rode Logan Briggs, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his eyes gleaming with rage. The man was built like a bull, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather vest, his hands gripping the reins as though he meant to tear the desert itself apart. Elias felt his stomach drop. Briggs. Of all the men in the territory, he was the one Elias least wanted to see. Owner of the largest cattle spread for miles, Briggs carried both wealth and bitterness like a badge. He had lost stock to Apache raids, brothers to border skirmishes, and in his mind, every Apache face was guilty of the same crime. Briggs yanked his horse to a halt just short of the militia's line, dust rolling past like cannon smoke. His 12 men fanned out, rifles lifted, their horses restless beneath the weight of imminent violence. "This ends now!" Briggs thundered, his voice raw with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the circle. "No savage ceremony on our land, no Apache tricks. Captain Hayes, I demand you break this up before blood spills." Hayes kept his horse steady, but his jaw tightened. "Stand down, Briggs. The situation is under militia authority now." "Authority?" Briggs spat. "You're letting 50 armed savages sit within spitting distance of our settlements while they make a hero out of this." His eyes landed on Elias, narrowing with venom. "This traitor!" The words struck harder than any rifle butt. Elias stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He had been called many things in his life: loner, failure, ghost of a man, but traitor was new. And it burned. Briggs leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying like a lash. "You've betrayed your own kind, Harper, giving away your horse, letting them weave their lies around you. You'd rather stand with savages than with your own people?" The settlers behind him murmured in agreement, nodding grimly. Fear and fury were easy to stir. Briggs knew it, and he wielded them like weapons. The Apache warriors shifted in their saddles, bows angled just low enough to signal they would not die quietly. Elias's heart hammered. This was the moment. Every path behind him had closed. He could no longer stand on the sidelines, no longer hope that silence would save him. He was trapped between two worlds, and both demanded an answer. The desert air thickened, vibrating with the weight of choices unmade. Elias felt the wooden cross in his pocket press against his chest, a reminder of promises whispered long ago. For the first time in years, he realized he had something to lose. Not land, not cattle, but a chance to be more than forgotten dust on the wind. And as Briggs' men cocked their rifles, Elias knew he could not turn back. The circle of Apache warriors stiffened as Briggs's men fanned out. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the tension of their riders. Painted faces turned, eyes sharp as flint. Hands edged closer to bowstrings and rifle stocks, but no one moved first. Briggs grinned at the sight, feeding off the tension like a wolf savoring blood. He raised his voice, letting it carry over dust and silence. "Look at them! 50 armed savages, painted for war, surrounding one of our own. And you," he jabbed a finger at Hayes, "you stand here and call this peace?" Hayes kept his reins steady, his jaw locked. "It's a ceremony, Briggs. That's what I've been told, and that's what I've seen." "Ceremony?" Briggs barked a laugh that cut like broken glass. "I've seen their ceremonies. They end with white blood soaking the dirt and cabins burning to ash. Don't let them fool you, Captain. This is no ritual. It's preparation for slaughter." Murmurs rippled among Maddox's men, some shifting uneasily, others nodding, fear painted across their faces. Fear was easy tinder, and Briggs struck sparks with every word. The Apache responded without words. As one, the warriors straightened in their saddles, their horses stepping closer together, the circle tightening until it looked less like a ritual and more like a fortress of flesh and will. Gideon Noshabo raised a hand, calm but resolute. "We came to honor. We take no blood today." Briggs spat into the dirt. "Your words are dust, Noshabo. Always have been, always will be." Elias felt the tension closing in on him like a vice. Every direction led to violence. He saw settlers' knuckles whitening on their rifles, Apache eyes flashing with restrained fire, and Hayes's militia shifting nervously, their discipline tested to its breaking point. Hayes barked an order to his men: "Hold the line." Muskets stayed angled, but one twitch of a trigger could undo everything. Briggs turned his glare back on Elias, voice dripping with venom. "And you, Harper, do you see it now? These people don't honor you. They use you. A fool's sacrifice for a savage's trick." Elias's chest tightened. The cross in his pocket pressed against his ribs, a weight both heavy and steady. Briggs's words cut deep, but not as deep as the silence that followed them. Everyone waited. Apache, settlers, militia alike, for Elias to speak, to prove or deny the charge. The desert held its breath. Wind whispered through the rocks, stirring dust into small spirals that vanished as quickly as they formed. Elias knew that if he stayed silent, Briggs's lie would become truth in the hearts of frightened men. And if that happened, the first shot would follow. Hayes's eyes flicked to him, sharp and searching. Not a command, not even a plea, just a recognition that the choice rested now with Elias Harper. He was standing at the edge of fire, and one step forward or back would decide which world burned. Elias stood in the eye of the storm, every gaze pinned to him. The settlers waited for him to deny Briggs' charge, to crawl back to their side and call the Apache liars. The warriors watched for him to stand firm, to prove their faith in his act of sacrifice had not been misplaced. And Captain Hayes's men, trained, tense, kept their fingers near triggers, waiting for the smallest spark. For a long moment, Elias could not breathe. He felt the dust dry in his throat, the heat pressing against his chest like a weight he could not lift. His hand went instinctively to his pocket, fingers closing around the small wooden cross worn smooth by years of touch. He remembered the night his wife had pressed it into his palm, her voice soft as a prayer. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Elias. It's choosing what's right, even when fear claws at your bones. That voice, long gone to the grave, filled his ears now, steadying him. He had lived as a ghost since her death, drifting like tumbleweed across the land, too hollow to stand for anything. But yesterday he had made a choice that had mattered. Today it demanded more of him. He stepped forward. The move drew a ripple through the crowd. Settlers stiffened, rifles tilting higher. Apache warriors shifted subtly, their hands brushing bowstrings, muscles taut. Hayes barked a sharp order, "Hold!" and silence fell again, thick and oppressive. Elias's voice broke the stillness, low and uneven at first, but carrying farther than he expected. "You think I was tricked, Briggs? That I gave away my horse because I was a fool? You think I did it because I was weak?" Briggs sneered. "That's exactly what I think." Elias shook his head slowly, his grip tightening on the cross. "You're wrong. I did it because she was dying, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I walked away." His eyes swept across the settlers, the militia, the Apache circle. "All of you, look at her." He pointed toward Tala, standing tall beside Duke. "She's alive because of a choice I made. That's no trick, that's truth." The settlers shifted, unease flickering in their eyes. Maddox frowned, his rifle wavering ever so slightly. Hayes's gaze sharpened, weighing Elias's words with the caution of a man who had seen too much blood wasted for pride. Briggs leaned forward, his face dark with fury. "You'll damn us all with your naive talk. Mercy for them means death for us." Elias drew in a breath that trembled, then steadied. "No, mercy is the only reason I'm still standing here. Maybe the only reason any of us are." The desert wind carried his words, scattering dust between the armed lines. For the first time, Elias felt the weight of his own voice, not as the mutter of a forgotten rancher, but as the choice of a man standing where no one else dared. And in that fragile silence, the tide began to turn. Elias stood in the circle's center, the cross clenched in his fist, his voice carrying in the desert air. All eyes were fixed on him, settlers waiting to condemn, Apache waiting to affirm, soldiers waiting to judge. He swallowed hard, then spoke louder, steadier. "All my life, I've been a forgotten man, a rancher scraping dust, a widower no one remembers. I thought I had nothing left to give, nothing left worth living for. But yesterday, when I saw her dying, His gaze drifted to Tala, her eyes dark and fierce in the morning light. I realized God still asks us to give, even when we have nothing. And in giving, we are not empty, we are made whole. Maddox shifted uneasily in his saddle, his rifle lowering just an inch. Briggs scowled, but the silence of his own men betrayed doubt creeping in. Elias raised his voice, his words cutting across the circle. If a forgotten man like me can find family among those you call enemies, then perhaps God still works among us. Perhaps he hasn't turned his face from this desert after all. The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. A murmur rippled through the Apache, low and resonant, like approval carried on the wind. Gideon Nashoba inclined his head, his scarred features solemn. Then Tala stepped forward. Her wound slowed her steps, but her presence filled the space with quiet power. She reached Elias's side and touched her hand to his arm, her voice clear though broken with accent. This man is not enemy. He is bloodkin. The phrase struck like lightning. Gasps broke from settlers. Murmurs surged among soldiers. To the Apache, it was no mere figure of speech. Bloodkin was sacred, an unbreakable bond, stronger than treaty, stronger than fear. Briggs's face twisted in rage. "Bloodkin," he spat. "He's no kin of yours. He's white. He's ours." Tala met his fury with calm fire. "No, he chose me. He gave what he had, his only horse, his only hope. That is kinship, spirit deeper than skin." The Apache warriors raised their fists to their chests in unison, a gesture of solemn recognition. Elias felt his knees weaken, the weight of the moment pressing down like a mountain, yet lifting him at the same time. For the first time since his wife's death, he was not invisible. He was chosen, not by blood, not by land, but by an act of grace that bound him to something greater. Captain Hayes shifted in his saddle, his sharp eyes scanning both sides. He said nothing yet, but Elias caught the faintest nod, as if the old soldier understood. This moment had tipped the balance. And in that balance, Elias Harper had ceased to be just a forgotten rancher. He had become the bridge. Briggs flushed red with fury, his voice booming across the desert. "Arrest him! Arrest Harper right now for treason against his own people!" His horse stamped and tossed its head as he jabbed a finger toward Elias. "He's siding with savages, spitting on everything we've bled for. If you don't put him in chains, Captain, I swear we'll do it ourselves." Maddox stirred in his saddle, rifle still raised but uncertain. He glanced at Elias, saw the blanket draped across his shoulders, the medallion glinting in his palm, Tala standing at his side. The scene didn't look like a hostage or a betrayal. It looked like something else, something he couldn't name. "Briggs," Maddox muttered, his voice rough. "The man saved a life. I don't see treason in that." Briggs whipped toward him, eyes blazing. "You going soft too, Sterling. Since when do we take mercy as loyalty? Every time we spare one of them, another cabin burns. Another family buries their dead. You want that on your conscience?" Maddox's jaw tightened. His rifle wavered. Some of the men behind him shifted uncomfortably, their confidence cracked by Tala's words, by Elias's trembling declaration. Doubt spread like cracks in dry clay. Hayes watched it all with the wary eyes of a man used to fragile truces. His militia line held steady, but he could see the settlers fracturing, the Apache waiting, and Briggs stoking fire with every word. The decision was coming, and it would fall to him, or to Elias. Briggs pressed harder, his voice a whip of venom. "You call him bloodkin? Then he's no longer one of us. He's an enemy, same as the rest, and enemies deserve a rope." His men shifted, some nodding grimly, others hesitating, caught between fear and conscience. Elias felt the circle closing, the old fear gnawing at his bones. But alongside it came something new, a quiet steadiness, born not from himself, but from something greater. He looked at Briggs and saw a man chained by hate. He looked at Maddox and saw doubt, the flicker of a choice waiting to be made.
"Captain," Briggs snarled, "do your duty. If you won't act, then I will." His hand slid toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. Hayes's voice cut like a blade. "You'll lower that rifle, Briggs, or I'll have you in irons myself." For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes, authority against defiance, soldier against settler. Then Briggs spat into the dirt, seething, but his hand froze on the stock. The air still crackled with danger. Elias felt the fragile balance teetering, waiting for one last weight to tip it toward peace or chaos. And he knew the next choice would not come from Briggs or Maddox or even Hayes. It would come from Gideon Neshoba. The tension rippled like heat over desert stone. Briggs seethed, Maddox wavered, the militia held steady, and the Apache circle waited in silence. Every man seemed locked in place, as if the earth itself held its breath. Then Gideon Neshoba moved. The chief dismounted with slow, deliberate steps, the weight of authority in every motion. His weathered hands held a small leather pouch, no larger than a fist, tied with a strip of sinew. He walked to the center of the circle, stopping before Elias. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Gideon's eyes, dark and steady, met Elias's. He lifted the pouch high so all could see. "Final gift is not tool or weapon," he said, his voice deep as thunder rolling across canyons. "It is seed. Corn, beans, squash, the three sisters that have kept our people alive through famine and war. With these you plant. With these you choose peace." He placed the pouch into Elias's hands. The leather was warm from the chief's touch, heavier than it had any right to be. Elias stared at it, his breath uneven. Gifts of food, tools, horses, all had stunned him. But this was different. This was not survival handed to him. It was responsibility entrusted. Gideon's voice carried to every ear, clear and unyielding. "This man is not traitor. He is bridge. He is proof that honor lives where we thought it lost. Any who harm him answer to Apache blood." The warriors struck their chests in unison, the sound sharp and resonant, echoing across the still air. Settlers flinched at the force of it, but many did not raise their rifles again. Elias clutched the pouch to his chest. His heart pounded, but for the first time the weight he bore did not feel like a curse. It felt like calling. Captain Hayes's horse shifted beneath him as he straightened in the saddle. The old soldier's eyes swept over the scene. The hardened settlers, the resolute Apache, the solitary rancher now cloaked in blanket and entrusted with seed. And something softened in his weathered features. He spoke low, almost to himself, yet the words carried. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope." The verse from Jeremiah cut through the dust and tension like a bell. For the first time, settlers and Apache alike fell into a silence that was not brittle, but contemplative. Elias felt his throat tighten. A future, a hope. Two things he had buried with his wife, lost in years of wandering. And now, impossibly, here in the desert, they had been handed back to him, not in certainty, but in seeds. Seeds he must choose to plant.
Behind him, Briggs cursed under his breath, but his men no longer mirrored his fury. Some stared at the pouch, at the blanket, at the Apache warriors who stood not as raiders but as guardians. Doubt gnawed at their anger. The climax of blood had passed without a single shot. In its place, something unexpected had taken root. And Elias knew nothing in this territory would ever be the same again. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The desert felt different once the last word had been spoken. For hours the circle had thrummed with tension, but now a hush fell over the land, not brittle with fear, but weighted with something Elias could not name. Hope, perhaps, or the fragile echo of it. Gideon Nashoba turned to his men and gave a single command. As one, the Apache warriors shifted in their saddles, the circle loosening for the first time since dawn. Horses snorted, feathers swayed, but the warriors' discipline held. No rush, no chaos, only the solemn dignity of men who had fulfilled their duty. One by one, they laid their hands across their chests, offering Elias a final gesture of respect before wheeling their mounts toward the open desert. The sound of hooves grew into a steady rhythm, then softened as the war party stretched into the horizon, their silhouettes fading into dust and sunlight. Tala lingered longer than the rest. She stood beside Duke, reins loose in her hand, her wounded shoulder bound with fresh strips of leather. She looked at Elias with a gaze that spoke what her broken English could not, a promise that the bond between them would not be forgotten. With a faint nod, she swung into the saddle and followed her people, Duke carrying her with the same patience he had carried Elias for years. And then, silence. Elias stood in the middle of the clearing, the ceremonial blanket heavy on his shoulders, the pouch of seeds pressing against his chest. Around him lay the remnants of the ceremony, bundles of dried meat, carved tools, silver trinkets that glittered faintly in the sun. They looked less like gifts now and more like anchors, tethering him to a path he had never chosen but could no longer deny. The settlers lingered, uneasy. Maddox removed his hat, running a calloused hand through his graying hair. His rifle sagged low across his saddle. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, not quite to Elias, not quite to himself. His men looked away, shame flickering across faces carved by suspicion. None rode forward to claim Elias as their own. But none fired a shot either. Briggs was another matter. His glare burned hotter than the desert sun, his fists white-knuckled on the reins. He spat into the dirt and yanked his horse's head around, galloping off with his men trailing behind like shadows. The dust of their departure hung bitter in the air, a reminder that hate rarely surrenders quietly. Captain Hayes watched them go, his expression carved from stone. When the dust settled, he turned his gaze on Elias. "You realize what just happened, Harper?" Elias met his eyes, weary but steady. "Feels like I've been marked, one way or the other." Hayes nodded slowly. "Marked, yes, but maybe chosen too. Not many men stand where you stood today and live to tell of it." He studied Elias a moment longer, then added in a voice touched with something almost reverent, "Perhaps God's hand still moves in this territory." The words lingered long after Hayes and his men rode away, leaving Elias alone amid the scattered gifts. The sun climbed higher, burning hot against his skin, but the blanket on his shoulders felt warm in another way, not the warmth of survival, but of belonging. The pouch of seeds pressed firm against his heart, a silent reminder of what had been placed in his care. Elias looked out over the desert, endless and harsh, yet suddenly alive with possibility. He was still a widower, still a solitary rancher, but no longer invisible, no longer without purpose. The world had seen him, chosen him, and now he would have to decide what to do with that choice. Night fell slowly, the desert trading its cruel heat for a chill that crept in with the stars.
Elias sat by a small fire, the flames snapping softly in the stillness. Around him, the bundles of gifts lay stacked, blankets folded, tools gleaming faintly in the glow. Beside him, the leather pouch of seeds rested where he had set it, as though waiting for his hand to claim it once more. The weight of the day pressed heavy on him. He replayed every moment. The tightening circle of warriors, Maddox's suspicion, Briggs's fury, Hayes's measured words, and over all of it, Tala's voice. Bloodkin.
He rubbed the wooden cross between his fingers, the old habit grounding him. He thought of his wife, her laughter, her prayers, the way she had believed he was meant for more than cattle and dust. She had spoken often of God's plans, even when illness drained the life from her cheeks. Elias had not believed her then. He had buried her, buried his hope, and wandered like a shadow of himself. But today, standing between Apache, settlers, and soldiers, he had spoken words he hadn't known he carried, words that had changed something, perhaps everything. A sound stirred the silence. Soft footsteps approached, and he looked up to see Tala moving carefully into the circle of firelight. She carried no weapons, only the faint grace of survival. Her wound slowed her, but her eyes were steady. She lowered herself onto the sand opposite him, folding her legs beneath her. For a while, they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Words seemed too small for what had been forged in the desert that morning. At last, Tala spoke, her English halting but clear. "You gave horse. You life." She touched her chest, then pointed at him. "Now we share breath, share path." Elias's throat tightened. He nodded, unsure what answer could match the weight of her words. "Maybe so," he murmured. "Maybe God meant it that way." She tilted her head, not understanding all of it, but her eyes softened with something like agreement. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the night sky. Elias leaned back, staring at the stars scattered like seeds across black soil. Hayes's words echoed in his mind, steady and sure. Perhaps God's hand still moves in this territory. He let the thought settle, deeper than doubt, stronger than fear. Perhaps his wandering had never been aimless. Perhaps every lonely mile, every empty night had led him to this, here, at the edge of two worlds, chosen not by power or bloodline, but by a single act of mercy. He reached for the pouch of seeds, turning it over in his hands. The leather felt rough, but inside he felt the small, stubborn weight of life waiting to be planted. A future, a hope. Tala watched him, her expression unreadable, but her presence steady, like the desert hills that endured storm and drought alike. He realized then that he was not as alone as he once believed. Elias set the pouch carefully beside the cross in his lap. For the first time in years, his heart felt steady. Not whole, not yet, but steady. A beginning. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that wavered like uncertain paths. Elias looked into the darkness beyond and felt no fear. Tomorrow would bring struggle, Briggs's hatred, settlers' doubt, the weight of expectation. But tomorrow also carried the promise of planting, of peace, of a bridge that no one had thought possible. And with the stars watching, Elias Harper bowed his head, whispering not a prayer of desperation, but one of quiet gratitude. For in the harsh desert of the frontier, God had given him not just survival, but a reason to live. The story of Elias Harper is not only about the frontier. It is about every soul who has ever felt forgotten, every heart that once believed its best days had passed. In the harsh silence of the desert, he discovered what many of us still long for, that mercy is never wasted, that hope can be planted even in barren soil, and that God's hand still moves in places where we least expect it.
Perhaps his journey reminds you of someone you once knew, or even of yourself, standing at the edge of two worlds, uncertain which path to take. These are not just tales of the past, they are lessons for our present. If this story stirred something in you, stay with us as we continue to share true Wild West stories where courage, faith, and redemption rise from dust and silence. Subscribe, share, and keep the fire burning.